The dust cloud on the horizon caught Kane Xerxes' attention, just as the sun began its descent toward the jagged peaks in the west. And he knew, before he even urged his horse forward, that whatever was out there in the empty stretch between his ranch and town wasn't going to be good news. He'd been riding the fence line checking for breaks when he spotted it, a strange dark shape that didn't move like an animal and didn't have the solid permanence of a rock or fallen tree. His gut twisted with the kind of instinct that had kept him alive through range wars and cattle rustles, and he dug his heels into his mare's flanks, pushing her into a gallop across the hard, packed earth of the Texas panhandle. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into something that made his heart lurch in his chest. A woman lay face down in the dirt, her dark hair spread around her head like a fan, her dress torn and covered in dust. Kane was off his horse before the animal had fully stopped, dropping to his knees beside her. His hands hovered over her back for a moment, hesitating, before he gently pressed his fingers to her neck. The pulse was there, thank God, steady but weak. He carefully rolled her over, and his breath caught at the sight of her face. Even streaked with dirt and pale from what must have been days without proper food or water, she was beautiful. But more than that, she looked utterly spent, her lips cracked and bleeding, her skin hot to the touch from sun exposure. Kane didn't waste time trying to wake her. He'd seen enough people pushed to their limits in this unforgiving land to know that her body had simply shut down from exhaustion. He scooped her up as gently as he could, surprised at how light she felt in his arms, and settled her across his saddle before mounting behind her. She didn't stir, not even when he adjusted her against his chest to keep her secure for the ride back to his ranch. The whole way he kept one arm wrapped firmly around her waist while the other held the reins, and he found himself talking to her in a low voice even though she couldn't hear him. "You're going to be all right," he murmured against her hair. "I've got you now. You're safe." The ride to his ranch house took nearly an hour, and by the time he reached the front porch, the sun had painted the sky in shades of orange and red. Kane called out for Maria, his housekeeper, as he carried the unconscious woman through the door. The older Mexican woman appeared from the kitchen, her eyes going wide at the sight of the stranger in his arms. "Dios mío," Maria breathed, crossing herself. "What happened?" "Found her out past the south fence," Kane said, heading for the stairs. "She's alive, but barely. I need you to help me get her cleaned up and into bed. And bring water, broth if we have any ready, and some of that salve you make for burns." Maria nodded and hurried to gather supplies while Kane carried the woman up to his guest room. He laid her on the bed as carefully as he could, then stepped back, suddenly aware of the impropriety of the situation. But there was no help for it. He couldn't just leave her in her torn, dirty clothes. When Maria appeared with a basin of water and clean cloths, he excused himself and went to wait in the hallway while the older woman tended to their unexpected guest. It was nearly an hour before Maria emerged, her face grave. "She is very sick, Señor Kane. The sun has hurt her badly, and I think she has not eaten in many days. Her feet are bleeding from walking. Whatever she ran from, it must have been very bad to push herself like this." "Will she live?" Kane asked, the question coming out more urgent than he'd intended. Maria's expression softened. "See, I think so. She is young and strong, but she will need much rest." "Days, maybe more," Kane nodded, relief washing through him. "Then she'll stay here until she's better. Keep an eye on her tonight, will you? I'll check on her in the morning." But Kane found himself unable to stay away. After Maria had retired to her own quarters, he crept back to the guest room and eased the door open. The woman lay still in the bed, cleaned up now and dressed in one of Maria's nightgowns. Her face was peaceful in sleep, and Kane could see the delicate bone structure beneath the sunburn and the traces of exhaustion. He pulled a chair up beside the bed and sat, telling himself he'd only stay for a few minutes to make sure she was breathing steadily. He woke with a start when the first light of dawn crept through the window, his neck stiff from sleeping in the chair. The woman hadn't moved. Her breathing was deep and even, and when he checked her forehead, she felt cooler than she had the night before. Maria found him there when she came to check on the patient, and she gave him a knowing look that he chose to ignore. The first day passed slowly. Kane tried to focus on his work around the ranch, but he found himself returning to the guest room every few hours. The woman slept through all of it, barely stirring even when Maria managed to get some water and broth down her throat. By evening, Kane was starting to worry again, but Maria assured him that this kind of deep sleep was what the body needed to heal from such extreme exhaustion. The second day was much the same. Kane rode out to check on his cattle, trying to give himself something to do besides hover over their mysterious guest. But his mind kept wandering back to her, wondering who she was and what had driven her to collapse alone in the middle of nowhere. The Texas Panhandle in October of 1882 was no place for a woman traveling alone. Dalhart was still a rough town, barely more than a railroad stop with a handful of buildings, and a population that swelled when the cattle drives came through. Most women who came to this part of the world did so with family or as mail-order brides. To find one wandering alone in the wilderness was more than unusual. It was alarming. That evening, Kane sat beside her bed again, studying her face in the lamplight. She looked better already, the worst of the sunburn fading to a more normal pink, her lips less cracked. Maria had braided her long dark hair to keep it manageable, and it lay over her shoulder like a rope of silk. Kane found himself wondering what color her eyes were, what her voice sounded like. He shook his head at his own foolishness. The woman had nearly died out in the desert, and here he was mooning over her like some lovesick schoolboy. On the third day, Kane woke before dawn with a sense of anticipation he couldn't quite explain. He went through his morning routine with unusual care, shaving and putting on a clean shirt before heading downstairs for breakfast. Maria caught his eye over her coffee and smiled but said nothing. After eating, he went to the guest room, knocked softly, and entered when there was no response. She was still asleep, but as he settled into his chair, he noticed her eyelids fluttering. He leaned forward, his heart picking up pace. For several long minutes, nothing happened, and he began to think he'd imagined it. Then, slowly, her eyes opened. They were green. Not just green, but the deep, rich green of pine trees in the mountains, flecked with gold around the pupils. She blinked several times, confusion clouding her gaze as she tried to focus on the ceiling above her. Then her head turned slightly on the pillow, and her eyes met his. Kane had been punched by angry steers, thrown from horses, and caught in a stampede once. None of those experiences had quite prepared him for the impact of that gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she tried to sit up, gasping as her body protested the movement. Kane was on his feet instantly, his hand on her shoulder, gently pressing her back down. "Easy," he said, his voice coming out rough. "You're safe. You're in my home, and you've been sleeping for 3 days. Her eyes widened, and he watched her process this information. Her lips parted as if to speak, but only a croak came out. Kane quickly poured water from the pitcher on the bedside table and held the glass to her lips. She drank greedily, and he had to pull it away before she made herself sick. "Slowly," he cautioned. "Your body needs time to adjust." She swallowed, winced, and then tried again. "Where am I?" The words were barely a whisper, her voice hoarse from disuse. "My ranch about 10 miles outside of Dalhart, Texas," Kane said, settling back into his chair but keeping his posture ready in case she needed help again. I found you collapsed out in the desert 3 days ago. You were in pretty bad shape. He watched emotions flicker across her face, fear, confusion, and then something that looked like resignation. She closed her eyes for a moment, and he thought she might drift back to sleep, but then she looked at him again, studying his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "Thank you," she finally said, "for helping me." Kane nodded, then realized this was the moment he'd been waiting for, though he'd told himself he wouldn't rush her. But now that she was awake, now that those green eyes were looking at him with a mixture of wariness and gratitude, he found he couldn't wait any longer to know at least this one basic thing about her. "What's your name?" he asked softly. She hesitated, and he could see her weighing whether to tell him the truth. Finally, she said, Sarah Hartley." "Kane Xerxes," he replied, offering her a small smile. "It's good to finally meet you, Sarah Hartley, even under these circumstances." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, and Kane felt something shift in his chest. "I suppose it could have been worse circumstances," she said. "I could have died out there." "You came close," Kane said, his voice growing serious. "Maria, my housekeeper, she's been taking care of you. Says you were severely dehydrated and suffering from sun exposure. Your feet were torn up pretty badly too. What happened to you out there?" The smile vanished from Sarah's face, and she looked away, her jaw tightening. "I'd rather not talk about it right now, if that's all right. I'm very tired." Kane wanted to press, wanted to know what had put that haunted look in her eyes, but he recognized the boundary she was drawing. "Of course," he said, standing. "You rest. Maria will bring you some broth in a bit, and we'll work on getting your strength back. Everything else can wait." He was almost to the door when her voice stopped him. "Kane!" He turned back to find her watching him, her expression vulnerable. "Thank you, not just for saving my life, but for letting me keep my secrets a little while longer." Something in his chest tightened at the trust implicit in those words, at the way his name sounded in her rough voice. "Everyone's entitled to their privacy," he said. "When you're ready to talk, I'll be ready to listen. Until then, you're safe here." Over the next few days, Sarah slowly regained her strength. Kane found reasons to check on her frequently, bringing her books from his small library, sitting with her while she ate the meals Maria prepared. At first, their conversations were brief and superficial, limited to discussions of the weather and the ranch. But gradually, as Sarah's body healed and color returned to her cheeks, she began to open up. Kane learned that she was 22 years old, originally from Missouri. She'd come west with her father and younger brother 2 years ago after her mother died, seeking a fresh start. They'd settled in a small town about 60 miles north of Dalhart, where her father had opened a mercantile. But 6 months ago, her father had passed away from a fever, leaving Sarah and her 15-year-old brother to manage on their own. "Robert's a good boy," Sarah said one afternoon as she sat in a chair by the window, looking out at the ranch. She was wearing a dress Maria had altered to fit her, and her hair was loose around her shoulders, gleaming in the sunlight. "Smart, responsible for his age. After Papa died, we tried to keep the store going, but it was hard. Money was tight and some of the men in town." She trailed off, her hands tightening on the armrests. Kane, who'd been leaning against the wall, straightened. "Some of the men what?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was careful, controlled. "There was a man, Walter Briggs. He owned the saloon and most of the other businesses in town. He decided he wanted to own our store too, and when Papa died, he saw his opportunity. He started pressuring me to sell, but the price he offered was barely enough to cover our debts. When I refused, he got more insistent, more personal." Kane felt anger kindle in his gut. He threatened you." "He did more than threaten," Sarah said quietly. "He made it clear that if I didn't sell and accept his proposal of marriage, things would get very difficult for Robert and me. He had the sheriff in his pocket, and most of the town was too scared of him to intervene. I kept refusing, and then one night—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "One night he came to our home with some of his men. They'd been drinking. I managed to get Robert out the back and told him to run to our aunt's place in Colorado. Then I ran too, in a different direction to draw them away from him." "Jesus," Kane breathed. "How long were they chasing you?" "I'm not sure," Sarah admitted. "Days blur together when you're running for your life. I had a horse at first, but it threw a shoe and went lame. I had to leave it behind. After that, I was on foot. I had a little food and water, but it ran out. I just kept walking, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and that town. The last thing I remember clearly is the sun rising on what must have been my third or fourth day. Then everything went dark." Kane moved to kneel beside her chair, his hands gentle on her arms. "Sarah, look at me." When she did, he was struck again by the strength he saw in those green eyes, even shadowed by fear and exhaustion. "You're safe here. I give you my word. And if Briggs comes looking for you, he'll have to go through me." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "You don't know what you're saying. Walter Briggs is dangerous. He has money and men who do whatever he tells them to do." "I've dealt with men like that before," Kane said grimly, "and I'm not some shopkeeper he can intimidate. This is my land, and I protect what's mine." The words hung in the air between them, and Kane realized how they must have sounded, as if he was claiming her. But before he could clarify, Sarah reached out and put her hand over his, and the touch sent electricity up his arm. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked softly. "You don't know me. I could be lying about all of this." Kane looked at their joined hands, then back up at her face. "You're not lying. I can see it in your eyes. And as for why, well, maybe I'm just doing what any decent person would do. Or maybe—" He paused, then decided to be honest. "Maybe from the moment I found you out there in the dust, I felt something, like I was meant to find you, like you were meant to be here." Sarah's breath hitched, and for a moment Kane thought she might pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hand. "I felt it too," she whispered. "When I woke up and saw you sitting there, I should have been terrified, waking up in a strange place with a strange man, but I wasn't. I felt safe." They stayed like that for a long moment, hands clasped, eyes locked. Then Maria's voice called from downstairs, breaking the spell. Kane stood, reluctantly releasing Sarah's hand. "I should let you rest. You're still recovering." "Kane," Sarah said as he moved toward the door. He turned back. "Thank you for everything." He smiled at her, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "No thanks necessary. Just get better." As the days passed, Sarah grew stronger. She began joining Kane and Maria for meals, first in her room, then downstairs in the dining room. She started helping Maria with small tasks around the house, despite both Kane's and Maria's protests that she should be resting. But Sarah insisted that she needed to feel useful, needed to earn her keep somehow. Kane found himself looking forward to these domestic moments with an intensity that surprised him. Coming in from a long day of work to find Sarah in the kitchen helping Maria prepare dinner, her sleeves rolled up and a smudge of flour on her cheek, made his house feel like a home in a way it never had before. Sitting across from her at the dinner table, listening to her laugh at Maria's stories, or watching her face light up when she talked about books she'd read, filled something in him he hadn't realized was empty. 2 weeks after Sarah had woken up, Kane came back from town with supplies and a troubled expression. Sarah, who'd been reading in the parlor, looked up as he entered, and her smile faded when she saw his face. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting her book aside. Kane glanced toward the kitchen where Maria was working, then gestured for Sarah to follow him out to the porch. Once they were alone, he turned to face her, his expression serious. "I was talking to the telegraph operator in town," he said. "There's been some men asking around about a woman matching your description. They claimed she was a thief who'd stolen from her employer up north, offered a reward for information." Sarah's face went pale. "Walter's men." "That's what I figured," Kane said. "I played dumb, said I hadn't seen anyone like that. But Sarah, if they're this close, they're not going to stop looking. And Dalhart's a small town. Someone might remember seeing me ride in with you that first day." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, her eyes distant. "I should leave. I've put you in enough danger already." "The hell you will," Kane said, his voice sharp enough that Sarah's eyes snapped to his in surprise. He took a breath, moderated his tone. "Sorry, but Sarah, you're not fully recovered yet. And even if you were, where would you go? Back out into the desert?" "To another town where Briggs might find you. I could head to Colorado, try to find Robert," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "That's the first place Briggs will expect you to go," Kane pointed out. "Look, I have an idea, but you might not like it." Sarah studied his face. "What kind of idea?" Kane took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair, then put it back on. It was a nervous gesture Sarah had come to recognize. "We could get married. Officially, I mean. Make you Sarah Xerxes instead of Sarah Hartley. A married woman has legal protection from other men's claims. And as my wife, no one would question your right to be here." Sarah stared at him, her mouth slightly open in shock. "Kane, you can't be serious. We barely know each other. You can't just marry me to keep me safe." "Why not?" Kane challenged. "People out here get married for all kinds of reasons. Convenience, land, security. At least we actually like each other. And Sarah, I won't lie to you. These past 2 weeks, having you here, it's been the happiest I've been in years. Maybe that makes me selfish, finding a reason to keep you here. But I think we could make it work. I think we could make each other happy." Sarah turned away from him, her hands gripping the porch railing. Kane watched the tension in her shoulders, gave her the space to think. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "What if I can't be what you need? What if I'm too broken from everything that's happened?" Kane moved to stand beside her, close enough that their arms almost touched. "We're all a little broken out here, Sarah. That's why we come to places like this, to have room to heal. I'm not asking you to be anything other than who you are. I'm just offering you a safe place to figure out who that is." Sarah turned her head to look at him, and Kane saw tears streaming down her cheeks. Without thinking, he reached up and brushed them away with his thumb, his hand lingering on her face. "We could start slow," he said softly. "A marriage of convenience, if that's what you need it to be. Separate rooms, no expectations. And if someday you want more, or if you want to leave, we'll figure it out together." "Why would you do this for me?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you risk so much?" Kane smiled, that gentle smile that transformed his usually stern face. "Because when I look at you, Sarah Hartley, I see someone worth risking everything for. Because in 2 weeks, you've become more important to me than anything else in my life. And because I think if you're honest with yourself, you might feel the same way." Sarah let out a shaky laugh through her tears. "Is it crazy that I do? Is it crazy that I feel like I've known you forever, that when I imagine my future, you're in it?" "If it's crazy, then we're both insane," Kane said. He took her hands in his, holding them gently. "Sarah Hartley, will you marry me? Will you let me protect you, care for you, and spend whatever time you'll give me trying to make you happy?" Sarah looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face, at the hope and vulnerability she saw there. She thought about the past 2 weeks, about how safe she'd felt in his home, how right it felt to sit across from him at dinner or read beside him in the evenings. She thought about how her heart raced when he smiled at her, how she found herself watching for him to come home each day. And she thought about the alternative, running again, always looking over her shoulder, always alone. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, Kane Xerxes, I'll marry you." The relief and joy that spread across Kane's face made Sarah's heart swell. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and Sarah buried her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of leather and sage and something uniquely him. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms as the sun sank lower in the sky. They were married 3 days later in the small church in Dalhart, with Maria and the local minister as witnesses. Sarah wore a simple blue dress that Maria had helped her alter, and Kane wore his best suit, looking uncomfortable but handsome. The ceremony was brief, the words familiar and strange all at once. When the minister pronounced them man and wife and told Kane he could kiss his bride, Kane looked at Sarah with a question in his eyes. She nodded, just slightly, and he leaned in and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and filled with promise. That night, true to his word, Kane showed Sarah to the guest room she'd been using. "This is still yours," he said, "for as long as you want it to be." Sarah looked at the room, then at Kane standing in the doorway, then back at the room. She thought about how empty the bed would feel, how she'd grown used to Kane's presence, his quiet strength. She thought about the kiss they'd shared at the altar and how it had made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt since before her father died. "Kane," she said, turning to face him, "would you stay with me? Just to sleep, just to be close. I don't want to be alone tonight." Kane's expression softened. "Are you sure?" Sarah nodded. "I'm sure." So Kane stayed, both of them lying on top of the covers, fully clothed. Sarah curled into his side, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Kane's arm was around her shoulders, holding her close. They talked quietly in the darkness, sharing stories from their childhoods, their hopes and fears. And when Sarah finally drifted off to sleep, she did so feeling safer and more content than she had in months. The next few weeks fell into a comfortable rhythm. Kane continued his work on the ranch, and Sarah took on more responsibilities around the house, though Maria insisted she didn't have to. But Sarah wanted to contribute, wanted to prove that she was more than just a burden Kane had taken on. She threw herself into learning how to manage the household, how to cook the hearty meals that ranch hands needed, how to preserve food for the winter months ahead. In the evenings after dinner, she and Kane would sit together in the parlor. Sometimes they read, sometimes they talked, sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence. And every night they went to bed together, though still in the guest room rather than Kane's larger bedroom. They held each other, shared gentle kisses, but didn't push for more. Kane seemed content to let Sarah set the pace, and Sarah was grateful for his patience. But as October turned to November and the weather grew cooler, Sarah found herself wanting more. She'd catch herself watching Kane as he worked, admiring the strength in his arms, the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt. She'd find excuses to touch him, brushing imaginary dust off his shoulder, straightening his collar. And she'd notice the way his eyes darkened when he looked at her, the way his breath would catch when she got too close. One evening, about a month after their wedding, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. Sarah was wrapped in a shawl against the chill, and Kane had his arm around her shoulders. She turned to look at him, studying his profile, and felt a surge of affection so strong it almost hurt. "Kane," she said softly. He turned to look at her, and whatever he saw in her face made his expression grow intense. "I love you." The words hung in the air between them. Kane's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Sarah," he breathed. "Are you sure? I'm sure, Sarah said, reaching up to cup his face with her hand. I think I've been falling in love with you since I woke up and saw you sitting beside my bed. I was just too scared to admit it, but I'm not scared anymore. I love you, Kane Xerxes. I love your kindness and your strength and the way you make me feel safe. I love waking up in your arms and falling asleep listening to your heartbeat. I love the life we're building together. Kane turned and pulled her fully into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. I love you too, he said fiercely against her hair. God, Sarah, I love you so much. From the moment I found you, you've been all I can think about. I was so scared you wouldn't wake up, and then when you did, I was scared you'd leave. Having you here, being your husband even in name only, it's been the greatest gift of my life. Sarah pulled back just enough to look up at him, and what she saw in his eyes made her heart race. It doesn't have to be in name only, she whispered. Not anymore. I'm ready, Kane. I want to be your wife in every way. Kane searched her face, making sure she meant it. Then he stood, scooping her up in his arms, making her laugh in surprise. He carried her into the house, up the stairs, but this time he didn't stop at the guest room. He carried her all the way to his bedroom, to the large bed he'd been sleeping in alone for years. He set her down gently on the edge of the bed, then knelt before her, his hands on her knees. Sarah, are you absolutely certain? We can wait as long as you need. I won't pressure you. Sarah reached out and ran her fingers through his hair, marveling at how soft it was. I'm certain, she said. I want this. I want you. I want to really be your wife. Kane rose and kissed her, and this kiss was different from the gentle ones they'd shared before. This kiss was deep and passionate, full of all the longing they'd been holding back. Sarah responded with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. They tumbled back onto the bed together, and as Kane's hands began to explore her body with reverent gentleness, Sarah knew she'd made the right choice. This was where she was meant to be with this man, building this life. They made love slowly, carefully, with Kane constantly checking to make sure Sarah was comfortable, that she wasn't scared. But Sarah wasn't scared at all. She felt cherished, desired, and completely safe. And when it was over, when they lay tangled together in the sheets, breathless and overwhelmed, Sarah knew that what had started as a marriage of convenience had become something real and profound. I love you, Kane murmured against her hair, holding her close. My Sarah, my wife. I love you too, Sarah replied, pressing a kiss to his chest. My husband, my home. The winter months were peaceful and happy. Sarah had never imagined she could feel so content, so fulfilled. She and Kane grew closer every day, learning each other's habits and preferences, their rhythms syncing naturally. They laughed together, worked together, loved together. The ranch thrived under their joint management, and Maria would often comment on how happy they both seemed, how right they were for each other. But in the back of Sarah's mind, there was always a shadow. Walter Briggs was still out there, and she had no idea if he was still looking for her. And then there was Robert. She worried about her brother constantly, wondering if he'd made it safely to their aunts, if he was all right, if he thought she was dead. In late December, Sarah finally confessed these worries to Kane as they lay in bed one night. He listened quietly, stroking her hair, then said, "Why don't we send a telegram to your aunt in Colorado, find out if Robert made it there safely? We can do it through a contact I have in another town, someone trustworthy who won't ask questions or spread gossip." Hope bloomed in Sarah's chest. "Could we really do that?" "Of course," Kane said. "You shouldn't have to live with that uncertainty. And if Robert is there and safe, maybe we can arrange for him to visit once things settle down more. Or hell, if he wants to come live with us, he can. We've got plenty of room." Sarah threw her arms around Kane's neck, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. "Thank you. Thank you so much." 2 weeks later, a response came back. Robert had made it safely to their aunt's house in Colorado and was doing well. He'd been sick with worry about Sarah, and their aunt had been about to hire someone to try to find her. The telegram Kane sent back assured them that Sarah was alive, well, and married to a good man. He invited Robert to visit in the spring when the weather improved and travel was safer. The relief Sarah felt at knowing her brother was safe was immense. It was as if a weight she'd been carrying for months had finally been lifted. That night, she and Kane celebrated with a special dinner that Maria prepared, and afterward they danced in the parlor to music from the old music box that had belonged to Kane's mother. Sarah rested her head on Kane's chest as they swayed together, feeling happier than she could ever remember being. "I want to give you everything," Kane murmured against her hair. "I want to fill your life with joy so complete that you forget what it felt like to be afraid." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes shining. "You already have. This life we're building, Kane, it's more than I ever dreamed of. You've given me safety and love and a home. You've given me hope for the future." Kane smiled and kissed her softly. "Then I'll just have to keep finding new ways to make you happy." As winter gave way to spring, the ranch came alive with new growth. The cattle that had survived the winter were fattening up on the fresh grass, and Kane hired a few more hands to help with the increased workload. Sarah found herself taking on the role of ranch wife naturally, managing the household accounts, coordinating meals for the workers, even learning to ride so she could accompany Kane on some of his rounds. In April, a letter arrived from Robert saying he'd like to visit in May if the offer was still open. Sarah was ecstatic, and she threw herself into preparing for her brother's arrival. She cleaned the second guest room from top to bottom, planned special meals, and worried constantly that Robert wouldn't approve of Kane or her new life. Kane found her fretting in the kitchen one afternoon and pulled her into his arms. "Sarah, love, it's going to be fine. Robert will be happy to see that you're safe and well cared for, and if he's half as smart as you say he is, he'll see how much we love each other." "But what if he blames me for leaving him?" Sarah asked, her voice small. "What if he thinks I abandoned him?" "Then we'll explain what happened and help him understand," Kane said firmly. "But I don't think that's going to be a problem. From what you've told me about your brother, he sounds like a good kid who loves his sister. He's going to be relieved to find you alive and happy." Kane was right. When Robert arrived in mid-May, his reunion with Sarah was tearful and joyful. The 15-year-old had grown taller in the month since Sarah had seen him last, but his face was still achingly familiar. He hugged her tight, and Sarah held on to him like she'd never let go. After the initial emotional reunion, Sarah introduced Robert to Kane. The teenager studied Kane with the wary protectiveness of a younger brother, but Kane met his gaze steadily and offered his hand. "It's good to finally meet you, Robert," Kane said. "Your sisters told me a lot about you." Robert shook his hand, then said bluntly, "You're taking care of her, really taking care of her." "I am," Kane said simply. "I love your sister, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure she's safe and happy." Robert looked at Sarah, who was watching this exchange with her heart in her throat. Whatever he saw in her face must have satisfied him, because he nodded and said, "Good. That's good." Robert's visit lasted 3 weeks, and by the end of it, he and Kane had developed an easy camaraderie. Kane taught him about ranching, let him help with the work, and treated him with the respect of one man to another. Sarah watched them together with a full heart, seeing the way Robert looked up to Kane, the way Kane naturally slipped into the role of mentor and protector. On Robert's last night before returning to Colorado, the three of them sat on the porch watching the stars come out. Robert was quiet for a long time, then said, "I'm glad you're happy, Sarah." After everything with Papa and then Briggs, I was afraid you'd never feel safe again. But I can see that you do here, with Kane." Sarah reached over and squeezed her brother's hand. "I am safe and happy, happier than I ever thought I could be." "Good," Robert said. He looked at Kane. "Take care of her." "Always," Kane promised. After Robert left, Sarah felt a sense of completeness she hadn't even realized she'd been missing. The last loose thread of her old life had been tied off. Her brother was safe and approved of her new life. She was building something lasting with Kane. For the first time in years, she wasn't looking over her shoulder or waiting for the other shoe to drop. She was just living. Summer came, hot and dry as it always was in the Texas panhandle. Sarah learned to love the landscape that had nearly killed her when she first arrived, the wide open spaces and endless sky. She learned to find beauty in the stark simplicity of it, the way the sunset painted the horizon in brilliant colors, the way storms rolled in from miles away so you could see them coming. One evening in July, Sarah realized her monthly courses were late. She didn't say anything at first, not wanting to get Kane's hopes up in case she was wrong. But as days turned into weeks and other signs appeared, she became more certain. Finally, one night as they were getting ready for bed, she took Kane's hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "Kane," she said softly, watching his face. "I think I'm pregnant." Kane's eyes went wide, and for a moment he just stared at her. Then a smile spread across his face, so bright and pure that it took Sarah's breath away. "Really? Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor," Sarah said, smiling back at him. "But yes, I think so. We're going to have a baby." Kane let out a whoop of joy and picked Sarah up, spinning her around until she was laughing and begging him to put her down before he made her dizzy. When he finally did, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her deeply. "A baby," he breathed against her lips. "We're going to have a baby. Sarah, you've made me the happiest man alive." "We made this baby together," Sarah reminded him, her hand covering his where it rested on her stomach. "This is our miracle, Kane. Our family." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Maria fussed over Sarah constantly, and Kane became even more protective than usual, though Sarah assured him repeatedly that she was perfectly healthy and capable of continuing her normal activities. As her belly grew, Sarah found herself marveling at the changes in her body, at the life growing inside her. She and Kane would lie in bed at night with his hand on her stomach, feeling the baby move, talking about names and plans for the future. They decided that if the baby was a boy, they'd name him after Sarah's father. If it was a girl, they'd use Kane's mother's name. They prepared the nursery together, painting the walls and building a cradle. Sarah sewed tiny clothes and blankets, and Kane carved wooden toys. It was a time of hope and anticipation, and Sarah fell even more in love with Kane as she watched him prepare to become a father. In February of 1884, on a cold night when the wind howled outside, Sarah went into labor. It was long and difficult, and there were moments when Kane, pacing outside the bedroom door while Maria and the doctor attended to Sarah, thought he might go mad from worry. But finally, as dawn broke over the ranch, he heard the sound he'd been waiting for, the sharp, strong cry of a newborn baby. The doctor opened the door and smiled at him. "You have a son, Mr. Xerxes, a healthy boy, and your wife did wonderfully." Kane rushed into the room to find Sarah propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, and Kane felt his own eyes filling as he approached the bed. "Meet your son," Sarah whispered. "Meet James Thomas Xerxes." Kane looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blankets, at the small features and shock of dark hair, and felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. This was his son. His and Sarah's. the product of their love, the future they'd built together. "He's perfect," Kane breathed, reaching out to gently touch the baby's cheek. "You're perfect. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for this gift." Sarah smiled tiredly. "Thank you for giving me a reason to hope again, for giving me this life, this family. I love you, Kane." "I love you too," Kane said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Both of you. My whole world." The years that followed were full and rich. James grew into a sturdy toddler with his mother's green eyes and his father's determined chin. When he was 2, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again, and this time they welcomed a daughter they named Catherine Rose. 2 years after that came another son, William, named after one of Kane's brothers who died in the war. The ranch prospered under Kane's management, and Sarah found fulfillment in managing their growing household and being a mother to their children. They hosted Robert for visits every summer, and he eventually decided to move to Texas permanently, settling on a piece of land adjacent to Kane's ranch and starting his own spread with Kane's help and guidance. Sarah never forgot those dark days when she'd been running for her life, exhausted and terrified. But they seemed like they'd happened to someone else, in another lifetime. The woman she'd been then, scared and desperate, had been transformed by Kane's love and the life they'd built together into someone strong and confident and joyful. Walter Briggs never came looking for her. Sarah later learned through Robert that he'd been arrested for fraud and assault not long after she'd escaped and had spent several years in prison. By the time he got out, he'd lost all his holdings, and Sarah Hartley, the woman he'd been obsessing over, had disappeared completely. There was no trace of her to find, because she no longer existed. She was Sarah Xerxes now, wife to a good man, mother to 3 beautiful children, and she'd built a life that no one could take from her. One evening, nearly 10 years after Kane had found her collapsed in the desert, Sarah stood on the porch watching the sunset. Kane came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. From inside the house came the sounds of their children playing, Maria's voice telling them to settle down before dinner, Robert's laugh as he joined in their game. "You ever think about that day?" Kane asked quietly. "The day I found you." Sarah leaned back against him, covering his arms with hers. "Sometimes, I think about how close I came to dying out there, how different my life would be if you hadn't found me, if you hadn't been the kind of man who'd stop to help a stranger." "I think about it too," Kane admitted. "I think about how empty my life was before you, how this house was just a building, not a home, how I was just going through the motions of living without really being alive." Sarah turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to touch his face. The years had added some lines around his eyes and a few threads of silver to his hair, but to her, he was as handsome as the day she'd first woken up to find him watching over her. "You saved my life that day," she said softly, "but you did more than that. You gave me a reason to want to live again. You gave me love and security and a family. You gave me everything." Kane smiled and kissed her gently. "You gave me everything too. You turned this ranch into a home. You gave me children and laughter and more happiness than I knew how to hold. You made me complete." "We made each other complete," Sarah corrected. "That's what love does. It fills in the empty spaces, makes us whole." From inside, Maria called that dinner was ready. Kane and Sarah exchanged a smile, then walked hand in hand back into the house, into the warmth and light and noise of their family. As they sat down at the table, surrounded by their children and Robert, Sarah looked around at the faces she loved and felt gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. This was her life now. Not the desperate, frightened flight through the desert. Not the fear and loss that had defined her for so long. This warm, chaotic, beautiful life full of love and laughter and hope for tomorrow. And it had all started with a cowboy who'd found her passed out from exhaustion and had the kindness to let her sleep for 3 days before asking her name, giving her the time she needed to heal before facing the world again. The years continued to unfold in a pattern of seasons and harvests, of children growing and new grandchildren eventually arriving. Kane and Sarah grew old together on the ranch they'd built into something prosperous and enduring. They sat on their porch on warm evenings, holding hands and watching the sunset, still as in love as they'd been in those early days. Their children grew strong and capable. James took over more of the ranch operations as Kane slowed down, showing the same dedication and skill his father had always demonstrated. Catherine married a young lawyer from Amarillo and gave them their first grandchildren, twin girls who wrapped both Kane and Sarah around their little fingers. William followed his uncle Robert into running his own ranch, showing an aptitude for breeding horses that made the family proud. Through it all, Kane and Sarah remained each other's greatest love and strongest support. They'd survived hardship and built something lasting, and they never took a single day together for granted. Every morning when Sarah woke in Kane's arms, she said a silent prayer of gratitude for the man who'd saved her life and then taught her how to live again. And every night when Kane held Sarah close, he thanked whatever force had led him to ride out along that fence line on that particular day all those years ago. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party at the ranch. The house was full of family and friends, of children and grandchildren running through the rooms that had once been so empty. Kane and Sarah stood together greeting guests, accepting congratulations, laughing at shared memories. When the party finally wound down and the last guests departed, Kane led Sarah out to the porch where they'd shared so many important conversations over the years. The stars were bright overhead, the air cooling as night settled over the land. 30 years, Sarah marveled, leaning against Kane's chest as his arms came around her. It seems impossible that it's been that long, and yet I can't remember a time when you weren't the center of my world. Best 30 years of my life, Kane said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. And I'm grateful for every single day. Every moment I get to spend with you is a gift. Sarah turned to look up at him, and even after all these years, her heart still skipped a beat at the love she saw in his eyes. I was so lost when you found me, so broken. I didn't think I'd ever feel whole again. You were never broken, Kane said firmly. You were healing. You just needed time and space and someone to remind you that you were worth saving. You did more than remind me, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. You showed me. Every single day, with every kind word and gentle touch and act of love, you showed me that I was worthy of good things, that I deserved happiness. You helped me believe in myself again. Kane cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall. And you showed me what it meant to really love someone, to put someone else's happiness above your own, to build a life that means something. Before you, I was just existing. You taught me how to truly live. They kissed under the stars, a kiss that held 30 years of shared history, of triumphs and struggles, of ordinary days and extraordinary moments. When they finally pulled apart, they stood wrapped in each other's arms, looking out at the land they'd built their life on. Do you remember what you asked me that first day I woke up? Sarah said quietly. After you'd let me sleep for 3 days, I asked your name, Kane said, smiling at the memory. I'd been so impatient to know who you were, but I wanted to give you time to recover first. You gave me more than time, Sarah said. You gave me respect. You gave me agency over my own story. You didn't demand answers or explanations. You just offered help and then stepped back and let me decide what I needed. That's because even then, before I knew anything about you, I knew you were strong, Kane said. I could see it in the way you'd pushed yourself to the brink of death rather than give up. I knew that kind of strength deserved respect. Sarah smiled and nestled closer to him. I fell in love with you during those 3 days, you know. Even unconscious, some part of me knew you were there watching over me, keeping me safe. When I finally woke up and saw your face, it felt like coming home. I fell in love with you the moment I found you, Kane admitted. I didn't know it then, didn't have words for it. But looking down at you in the dirt, so vulnerable and yet somehow still fierce, I felt my heart recognize you, like it had been waiting for you all along. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the chirp of crickets, the whisper of wind through the grass. This land, this life, this love, it was everything Sarah had never known to hope for and more than Kane had ever dreamed possible. Thank you, Sarah whispered finally, for finding me, for saving me, for loving me. Thank you for letting me, Kane replied. For taking a chance on a rough cowboy who didn't know the first thing about wooing a lady properly. Sarah laughed softly. You did just fine. Better than fine. You gave me exactly what I needed when I needed it. Patience and kindness and a love so steady I could build my whole life on it. That's all I ever wanted to give you, Kane said. All I'll ever want is to see you happy and safe and surrounded by love. Mission accomplished, Sarah said, smiling up at him. I'm the happiest woman alive, Kane Xerxes. And it's all because 30 years ago, you were kind enough to stop for a stranger in trouble. Best decision I ever made, Kane said, kissing her again. And I'd make it 1,000 times over. The years continued to pass, and Kane and Sarah grew old together with grace and gratitude. They remained active on the ranch as long as they were able, then gradually let their children take over more of the daily operations. But they never stopped being partners, never stopped supporting and loving each other through whatever challenges arose. When Kane was 72, he fell ill with pneumonia. Sarah sat by his bedside day and night, holding his hand, reading to him, reminding him of all the good years they'd shared. The children came, bringing the grandchildren, and the house was full of the family they'd created together. One afternoon, as Kane drifted in and out of consciousness, he opened his eyes to find Sarah sitting beside him as she had been that very first time he'd watched her sleep all those decades ago. He smiled weakly and squeezed her hand. "My Sarah," he whispered, "my beautiful wife." "I'm here," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm right here, my love, always." "Best life," Kane murmured. "Best love, no regrets." "No regrets," Sarah agreed, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "Only gratitude, thank you for every day, every moment. Thank you for being the man I could build my life with." "Thank you for being found," Kane said, his voice fading. "Thank you for saying yes, for loving me back." "Always," Sarah whispered. "I'll always love you, Kane, in this life and whatever comes after." Kane's eyes drifted closed, and his breathing slowed. Sarah held his hand and continued talking to him softly, telling him about their children and grandchildren, about the ranch they'd built together, about the love that had sustained them through decades. When he finally slipped away peacefully in his sleep, Sarah was there holding his hand, just as he'd been there for her all those years ago when she'd needed someone most. The grief was profound, but Sarah found comfort in her family and in the memories of the beautiful life she and Kane had shared. She lived for another 5 years after Kane's passing, spending her days surrounded by children and grandchildren, sharing stories about the man she'd loved for more than 3 decades. On a warm spring evening, sitting on the porch she'd shared with Kane for so many years, Sarah closed her eyes and didn't open them again. The doctor said she'd passed peacefully in her sleep. No pain or struggle, just a gentle transition from one world to the next. Her children liked to think she'd simply decided it was time to be with Kane again. They buried her beside him on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the wide Texas sky they'd both loved. And if the wind sometimes seemed to carry whispers of laughter and love across the land, if the house still felt warm and welcoming despite being occupied by new generations, well, that was just proof that some loves are so strong they echo through time. The ranch stayed in the family for generations, each new group of children growing up hearing the story of how it all began. The tale of the cowboy who found a woman passed out from exhaustion and let her sleep for 3 days before asking her name became family legend, told and retold around dinner tables and campfires. It became a reminder that kindness and patience and genuine care can transform lives, that love can bloom even in the harshest circumstances, and that the best things in life are often worth waiting for. And so the legacy of Kane and Sarah Xerxes lived on, not just in the land they'd built or the family they'd raised, but in the example they'd set of what real love looks like. A love that was patient and kind and steady. A love that gave space for healing and growth. A love that saw past fear and pain to the strength and beauty underneath. A love that lasted until the very end and then beyond. In the town of Dalhart, Texas, where the story began, old-timers still sometimes talked about the mysterious woman who'd appeared out of nowhere and the cowboy who'd given her a second chance at life. And they'd smile and nod, because they'd seen firsthand how that chance had blossomed into something beautiful and lasting, proof that even in the harsh reality of the Wild West, love could not only survive but thrive. The house on the Xerxes ranch still stood decades later, expanded and improved by successive generations, but still fundamentally the same structure where Kane had brought Sarah that first day. And in the guest room where Sarah had first woken up, where she'd recovered her strength, and then later shared her first real conversation with Kane, there was a small plaque that the children had installed years after both their parents had passed. It reads simply, "Here began a love story for the ages. May all who rest in this room find the peace, healing, and new beginnings that Sarah Hartley found here in 1882. And that, really, was the heart of the story, not just a tale of rescue and romance, though it was certainly that. But more deeply, it was a story about second chances and the transformative power of genuine love. About how sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us exactly where we need to be. About how patience and kindness can heal wounds that seemed unhealable. About how two broken people can come together and make each other whole. It was a story about a cowboy who saw someone in need and stopped to help without asking for anything in return. About a woman who'd been through hell and found the courage to trust again. About the life they built together from those desperate beginnings, a life filled with love and laughter and purpose. And it was a story that proved that fairy tales could happen even in the rough reality of the Texas panhandle in the 1880s. That happily ever after wasn't just for storybooks, but could be built with hard work and dedication, and most importantly, with love that was patient enough to let someone sleep for 3 days before even asking their name. The end.